Welcome back to my channel. Today I have gluten-free veggie pasties for you, and I'm making the puff pastry from scratch. All gluten-free, really simple to make but very time consuming. So if you are planning on recreating this recipe, you'd better start the day before to give yourself some time to get through all the elements. If you've been following along my channel for a while now, you'll notice that I like to use ingredients that are readily available from your everyday supermarket. This recipe is no exception. Making this dough is the same as making a bread or a pizza dough, so I'm not going to talk you through that process. However, I will start to talk you through the rest of the process. So after you've made your dough, you roll it out into a big square, wrap it up in Glad wrap and pop it in the fridge to chill for about 30 minutes because you want your dough to be nice and cold. Whilst you're waiting for the dough to chill for 30 minutes, you can cut up some butter and make it into a rectangle slab so that when you are ready to put it on top of your dough, it can be enclosed in the dough like an envelope. So you'll see what I mean here. I'm cutting the butter up and I'm sticking it all together. I like to use baking paper whenever I do any form of gluten-free baking because if the product starts to stick, it's much easier to add a second piece of baking paper, flip it onto itself and remove the baking paper so that you don't tear your dough or whatever it is that you're making. So once I've done the butter, it also goes into the fridge and just chills until the dough has finished chilling. This process doesn't take long, so it ends up chilling for about the same time as the dough. When you get the dough out, flip it onto your bench and start to roll it out a bit bigger so that it can be larger than the butter slab that you've made. Pop the cold butter slab straight into the center of the dough and then start to enclose the butter with the dough. So you'll see in this video some sections I've got short on dough and I've just got my rolling pin, rolled it out a bit bigger just so that it can cover all of the butter before I start to roll it out again. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I'm not a trained chef, I'm not a trained pastry chef or anything of the like. So what you see here is just a home cook experimenting and trying to make gluten-free tasty food, and I feel like I've nailed that aspect. So once you've put the butter in, roll it out. Don't criticize the technique. Like I said, I'm not a trained professional, I'm just doing what I can. So we fold the dough onto itself so that you end up getting layers at the end of the process. You'll see some butter is like poked out from where I've encapsulated it earlier. Just pat it down on itself. Like I said, you don't have to be technically perfect, although you should be with stuff like this. Mine still worked out delicious. So you roll it out. I'm calling that the first fold. And then when you fold it onto itself in thirds again and turn it 90 degrees, that's your second fold. I did this 3 times and then the dough started to get a bit warm, so you have to put it in the fridge because you want the butter in the dough to be cold. So remember when I said at the start of this video that this is not a hard recipe, but it's a time-consuming recipe? This is the time-consuming part. Every time the dough gets turned, it technically should go into the fridge to firm up. I tried to speed things along and I would do 2 turns and then put it in the fridge for 30 minutes and repeat that process. All in all, I did about 7 turns here. I think I miscalculated and counted wrong, but you are free to do as many folds as you like, but the more folds, the more layers when the pastry goes into the oven and puffs up. Whilst you're letting your dough chill in the fridge, you can be doing other things. So this particular recipe, I use the pastry to make veggie pasties. If you're trying to be time efficient, you could be cutting up all your veggies at the same time that the dough is chilling in the fridge and leave the veggies aside for when you're ready to compile everything. I let this dough stay in the fridge overnight before I used it. Not because it necessarily needed it, but because I wasn't ready to do the next part of the process, which was to make the actual veggie pasties. So there are a few shortcuts you can take to save on time, but it's that whole popping it in the fridge and letting it firm up, that's what takes the time. Then when you take it out of the fridge and you roll and you fold and you turn, that process takes a few minutes. It's a lot of the waiting around in the fridge time that you can be filling in with other bits and pieces for your recipe. So I'm getting closer to the end here. As I said, I left this overnight, but you can leave it for 1 to 2 hours and then roll it out and use it straight away if you're ready to use it. I also had leftover dough after I did what I needed to do and left it in the fridge for another 24 hours, and it was perfectly fine to roll out the day after as well. It tasted great, it cooked up really well, and I've actually popped these pasties that I've made in the freezer because it made so many and there's no way we could have eaten them all in one sitting. So this is the point now where all of the folding and turning has taken place and the dough is resting in the fridge. These veggie pasties used whatever vegetables I had lying around in the fridge. Some were on their way out, some were fresh. It's just what I had. So chop up the potatoes first because you want to boil them in salted water to make them into a mashed potato that will get added into your mixture. Once that's on the stove, you can start chopping all of your ingredients to go in the fry pan and that will all get cooked up. I used onions, zucchini, broccoli, carrots, peas, corn, and celery. Now, I don't think I've forgotten anything there, but that's what I had available and that's what I decided to use. And I found that combination of vegetables to be quite delicious together. It's a tedious process cutting all of the vegetables to approximately the same size, but I think that's important so that when you're eating a pasty, you don't have big veggies overpowering other ones. You get a good, decent taste of them all at the same time. I cut up all of these veggies the next day when I was ready to use the dough because I wasn't ready to cook the pasty mix the same day that I made the dough. You can make this pasty filling and you can leave it in the fridge. It is fine to use the next day. It's even fine to use the day after. It's a matter of how much time you have and how much you want to prep whilst the dough is chilling in the fridge. So when you get to start frying these vegetables, I fried them in a particular order based on what I think needed to be cooked a bit more first, what vegetables I wanted to flavour the olive oil that went into the pan, how I wanted to cook off the couple of spices that I put in there. But again, if you want to just chuck everything in the pan at the same time, you've cut all of the vegetables the same size. They're going to cook pretty evenly, but I wanted to let a few more veggies have longer in the pan and let off their aromatics and whatever before I added everything in. So that's another shortcut you can take here. You can just forget about trying to put things in bit by bit, just chuck it all in, mix it all around, cook it a bit longer. It's going to taste the same at the end of the day, but I liked to step the process, put the curry powder in, let that cook a little bit, then add in the next few things. I also decided to cook the corn in with the potatoes after the potatoes had already finished cooking. So it was simply just pop them in and let them warm through a little bit, enough before I cut the kernels off the cob. Just little things like that. You could be doing it a lot more time efficient. You don't even have to use corn on the cob. You can use kernels. You can probably use canned corn if you've got that. And that just takes away another one of those steps in this whole process. Another thing I'm doing here is adding some starchy liquid from the potatoes to the pan where I found that it was a bit dry and needed a little bit of extra moisture. When you make the mashed potato, I didn't add any butter or cream to it. I just simply mashed the potatoes after they'd been drained. So you're not expecting to add a lot of moisture back into this mixture, and you don't want it to be runny. You don't want it to make the pastry soggy. You just want it to hold itself and have enough moisture so that it's not dry. Okay, we're nearing the finish line here. We're adding in the last of the vegetables that don't take as long to cook. So the peas and then the corn kernels, which are already cooked. And it's simply just to take up the rest of the flavour from the pan, the curry, the garlic powder, more so than anything. They don't need to be recooked. They just want some flavour. Once I get all of this sorted into the pan, turn it off. It's best to let your mixture cool down before you put it into your pastry. So now's the fun part, checking on the pastry you made the night before or a few hours before. You can notice that I'm struggling to roll this out. It is that firm, but cutting it off into smaller sections made it a lot more manageable to roll out. And then when I rolled it out, it looked a bit like the map of Tasmania, but other than that, it was perfect because I was able to cut the right amount of circles that I needed and make small bite-sized pasties. Yes, I was going to say pasties, but I meant pasties. This is a completely different dough to my pastizzi dough, and you will see that video on my channel, which I don't know, I made maybe 2 or 3 years ago, if not longer. And you'll see the difference in the pastries there. So this is that same technique that I was talking about earlier, where I use an extra piece of baking paper to help take the dough away. It's better than pulling the dough from the baking paper because you're more likely to rip the dough. But if you're pulling the paper away from the dough is more likely to stay intact. And this goes for a number of dough recipes, pizza doughs, bread, etc., biscuits even. So I'm using a circle cutter here to cut out smaller sized pasties because I had intended that they would just be a footy snack for the grand final long weekend, and you can just grab one as you please. But it doesn't take much filling, and I had so much filling that I decided after making about 10 of the small ones, I was going to start making bigger pasties. And I actually got, I think, 10 pasties, large pasties out of this dough and 10 small pasties. So that's quite a bit, and I still had a lot of the filling left over afterwards. I'm simply using a beaten egg to seal the pastry, and I'm trying not to overfill the crescents too much because, as you can see there, the dough can rip quite easily. It doesn't change anything, it's just got a hole in it now. But before I pop them in the oven, I've added a little bit of milk to the beaten egg and used that as a glaze. Cooked them for about 30 minutes, the smaller ones, and they are beautiful and golden. So it is worth the sitting around and waiting, but you can, like I said, prep a few of these elements the day before. Pulling apart that pastry, it's nice and delicate, really tasty, soft and melts in your mouth. Might not be as flaky as a traditional puff pastry, but it's pretty damn close. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.